on 938 Live. This is Talkback.
Now, do you remember the turbulent late 50s and early 60s in Singapore's history? Do you remember concerns with communism in Singapore? Do you remember the speeches by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew during the battle for merger with Malaya? What did they mean to you then? And did the outcome of these events have an impact on you, your families? You can start calling us on 669-11938 and share with us your experience.
Well, I have to say, I wasn't born then. So I was born in the late 70s. I have no idea what it was like in the 50s and 60s. But I do know of several people who know what it was like in the 50s and 60s, namely my parents.
Correct, mine
for
as
one
well.
thing. Not too many stories emerging from my parents' mouths, though. I mean, they talk about the race riots at the time. They talk about how Mr. Lee Kuan Yew broke down on camera.
Yes.
That's something they vividly remember, but nothing much else. So hopefully the former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's book, The Battle for Merger, will shed some light on this.
Right.
A reprint has been launched. Now, the book was first published in 1962. The highlight are the transcripts of 12 radio talks from 1961. Mr. Lee was arguing the case for merger with Malaya as the way to independence. And in those talks, he tried to persuade Singaporeans to support merger with Malaya for our survival and the way to independence. Now, the context of the radio talks was merger, but their key focus was to prevent Singaporeans from being confused by the communists and to expose what their real aims were in opposing merger. Now, the authorities made the decision last year to reprint the book to counter revisionist views that portrayed the fight as merely a peaceful and democratic disagreement over the type of merger.
Now, can you remember the significant events that took place before and after Singapore merged to become part of Malaysia? And how did some of the events then shape maybe your thinking as Singapore developed over the years towards becoming a nation? And even if you were not born, during the inception of our tiny nation, do those events mean anything to you today?
Should they mean something to you is another question as well.
That's another thing, yeah.
Call us 669-11938. Talk to us also on Facebook, official 938 Live.
Now, the new version of the book contains a message by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the historical context and background, as well as footnotes to accompany the transcripts. Now, Deputy Prime Minister Teo Chee Hean, who actually officiated at the book's relaunch, said that the events of that period remain relevant today. DPM Teo pointed out that the Communist Party of Malaya's armed struggle and the Communist United Front's efforts to destabilize Singapore before, during and then after the battle for merger have been well documented by various academics and writers. And these include top leaders of the Communist Party of Malaya as well, Chin Peng and Fong Chong Pik. It was important that Singaporeans made the right choice at that time and chose a non-communist future. Mr. Teo is also Coordinating Minister for National Security and Minister for Home Affairs, said that the pioneers' determination to rise above hardships, including the threat of communism, and focus on making Singapore a better country for the next generation is definitely an inspiration for all Singaporeans. So what are the lessons that we can draw from the events of the battle for merger? And, well, do these events hold any significance for our younger and even newer Singaporeans?
I wonder if those of you who lived through those times or know something about those times actually talk to your kids about these issues. To what extent do you think it's important for them to know about these issues and why? What other moments in Singapore's history, perhaps, you feel we need to be reminded of from time to time?
Absolutely.
And this could be something that happened like 5 years ago. You know, and perhaps you think it needs to be recorded in the annals of history as a learning point for future generations, for instance.
Sure.
Give us a ring, 669-11938. Joining us today is Associate Professor Kumar Ramakrishna. He's head of the Centre for Excellence for National Security at the Nanyang Technological University. Good morning, sir. Now, what is the significance, would you say, of the reprinting former PM Lee Kuan Yew's book, The Battle for Merger?
Hi, good morning. It's good to be here. Next year is Singapore's 50th anniversary of independence, so I think it's timely for Singaporeans to take stock of how we got to be what we are as a nation and what were the significant milestones along the way. And just now, Bharati, you mentioned that there are certain significant historical milestones that perhaps Singaporeans of all ages, particularly the young, should pay attention to. And, well, for example, the Japanese occupation, certainly the Malayan emergency,
Sure.
merger, separation. So, confrontation, absolutely.
Yeah.
So these are all very much part of Singapore's own narrative or story. So it's quite understandable that, with the 50th anniversary just around the corner, there's a lot of interest in looking back at some of these key events.
One would hope that these events would be in our consciousness regardless of it being Singapore's 50th anniversary. However, aren't these things really talked about in school already, in history books, history lessons?
I believe that they are, but perhaps there's potentially some scope for improving the way in which history is taught, or history is promoted as a subject within schools, and even the way it is studied at higher levels. I remember when I was young, history was pretty much an attempt to sort of memorize dates and all that.
Yeah.
It was very intimidating for me, I have to say.
Yeah.
I didn't do too well in history. My secondary school teachers would attest to that. So what sort of changes and approaches do you think we need? Perhaps now that we're on the cusp of celebrating our 50th anniversary, it's time to take a look at why these things are relevant and how the relevance can be driven home to Singaporeans of today.
Well, for example, I think this reissue of the Battle for Merger book and series of radio talks is a good opportunity to draw attention again to a very significant part of Singapore's history in 1961-62. The whole issue of whether or not Singapore should go it alone or be part of a wider political and economic union with the Malay Peninsula was certainly very much on the agenda.
Right.
The Battle for Merger radio talks at one level was about that. Mr. Lee was trying to persuade the population to support the idea of merging with the Malayan Peninsula. But at that time, his political opponents, the Barisan Socialists, this was after the big split.
After the break, you're right. That's
in
right.
July 61. The Barisan Socialists was against merger. So the Battle for Merger radio talks was an attempt by Mr. Lee to sort of unmask, so to speak, the fact that the Barisan was a front for the Communist United Front, which had been in existence for quite a long while actually before that, and to sort of expose their United Front tactics, how the communist underground tended to use front organizations like labor unions, students' unions to operate while the rail operatives were in the background. So Mr. Lee was trying to draw the curtain on those sort of tactics and explain why the communists would not want merger. Basically, the communists would not want merger because they realized that if Singapore at that time, which is under British administration, were to combine with Malaya, the central government in Malaya, which was strongly anti-communist and very conservative, would crack down on the Communist United Front in Singapore.
Right.
Because they didn't want Singapore to be, as they said at that time, a second Cuba. Right, so
at the doorstep, so to speak, right?
Particularly since the Malaya, the Federation, had just defeated a long-running communist insurgency, and they knew, in fact, both sides knew, the British knew, that by the middle of the 1950s, when the communists in Malaya began to realize that the shooting war in the jungles was not succeeding,
correct,
they switched strategy to focus on Singapore. And engage in United Front tactics, infiltration of unions.
And so agents of the CPM moved down,
That's right.
The central, the Communist Party of Malaya.
That's right. So the Communist United Front, they had this protean shape-shifting ability because, they were really, really very good. I mean...
Very formidable force, clearly.
Formidable
That's
force.
why all this was needed to counter it.
Absolutely. So Singapore was seen as a potential... by the British, by the Malayans, certainly by the Singapore leaders, the non-communist leaders.
That's right.
Singapore was particularly vulnerable in 1961-62. So that's why merger was one, apart from the wider political economic rationale for merging Singapore with Malaya.
Right.
The need to sort of also deal with the communists on the island was also an important rationale.
And obviously, all of these things could happen again today, right? I mean, we're talking about relevance. All of these things, of course, in a different shape and form, could happen today. Wouldn't you say?
Well, what I think we could extract from this particular historical episode is the importance of guarding against extremist ideologies. I mean, at that time, communism was a pretty extreme ideology which justified violence in the pursuit of political goals. Today, we have a different species of ideology which is just as extremist, perhaps even more violent. Although people would argue that.
Right.
And so there's always a need to sort of guard against extremist ideology. And particularly now, we have the social media. Back then, there wasn't the social media.
Absolutely. So it's a different playing front altogether.
Yeah, it's become more complex. So from a governance perspective, the challenges are amplified.
Right. Now, let's just come back to this battle for merger. Not many people would know that the PAP did try to embrace elements of the communists to try and get them to, I suppose, see their way that merger was necessary. But, I mean, the thing is, with that sort of embracing, I mean, eventually the communists did want their way. And you know, I mean, it sort of brought quite a bit of strife to the country in a sense.
That's right. Essentially, the communists, they historically have tended to toggle between two approaches to gain power. One is armed struggle. The other is united front, peaceful, constitutional united front tactics. If they can't get their aims of securing political power through armed struggle, they will do so through united front, which basically what that means is they will penetrate legal organizations like trade unions, student movements, rural associations, political parties. So that's essentially, when you look at what happened to the PAP, when it was formed in November 1954, it was an attempt by the non-communist faction led by Mr. Lee to sort of combine with the leftists, which included the communists, because at that time, the non-communist faction within the PAP understood that in order to get any headway in the anti-colonial struggle, to form a powerful coalition to sort of ultimately get the British to give up power, you needed to work with the left wing. And the left wing controlled the unions and the students. So there was this marriage of convenience, essentially. Both sides knew there was a marriage of convenience. Ultimately, they would break. So the question was, at what point and over what issue the alliance would break. That issue turned out to be merger.
Merger, indeed. Stay with us on 938 Live. Tell us if you lived through those periods. Does it still hold relevance for you today? Do you talk to your children about such issues, especially in the lead up to Singapore's 50th anniversary? Call us 669-11938. We'll talk to you right after news and sports on 938 Live.
Do you remember significant events that took place before and after Singapore merged to become part of Malaysia? Do you remember the events that led up to the merger with Malaysia and how Singapore developed towards becoming a nation? A reprint of former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's book, The Battle for Merger, has been launched and first published in 1962. The highlight of this book are the transcripts of 12 radio talks from 1961 by then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, arguing the case for merger with Malaya as the way to independence. Now, if you have any memories whatsoever, call us 669-11938 and it'll be a real pleasure to hear from those of you who lived through that time. Now, in the studio joining us today is Associate Professor Kumar Ramakrishna. He is head of the Center of Excellence for National Security at the Nanyang Technological University. Now, Kumar, let's look at one of the things that happened during that time, Operation Cold Store. What effect did that have on the struggle against the communists then?
Yeah, Operation Cold Store was an internal security dragnet launched in February 1963 to essentially roll up the Communist United Front, which at that time was threatening the stability of Singapore. It was not the first such dragnet. Over the 50s, the course of the 50s, throughout the emergency, the British authorities had engaged in similar operations to sort of try to break up the communist apparatus. But Cold Store was perhaps the most important one because as a result of that operation, even the Secretary General Chin Peng himself said in his book that essentially shattered the underground network throughout the island.
Let's see what Mr. Lim has to say about this. He's just called us on 669-11938. Hi, Mr. Lim. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I'm Mr. Lim. I'd like to discuss about the post-independent events. Yeah?
Sure.
For me, I'm an English-educated person, but most of the significant events post-1965 is the closing of the Chinese medium school and Nanta as well.
Why do you feel those are the most significant events?
Because it fundamentally changed the culture, the language landscape of Singapore post-independence, and that has a major make a difference to the current thinking of the current generation as well.
You have nothing to say about pre-independence, sir?
Pre-independence, well, it's probably the losing battle of the so-called, I don't think I got anything to say about that. Sorry about that.
well, don't be sorry. But the point really is here that, of course, in the lead up to our 50th anniversary, 50th birthday, lots is being said about the period in the lead up to independence, and battle for merger is what we're talking about today. I'm sure you have noticed that that is what the focus has been on today. To what extent, even though you might not have been totally sentient then as a being and totally in the know about what was going on, to what extent do you think it is important for us to look back in history?
Yeah, I think that politically, I think there's a lot of things that we do not know. I'm not sure whether we get a full picture of through the medium, through the TV and the radios and newspaper, because I don't think that the main media here in Singapore is totally free of political decision as well, I think, yeah.
Well, that is an issue for lots of people. To what extent do you think more effort needs to be made in order to understand history in a balanced way and to understand its relevance to our lives today? And how can more of that be done?
For example, that shows, like, I think, is it the Left from Singapore? Or is it that show by, I can't remember, it was banned from Singapore? I mean, who is to judge that that film is not suitable for Singapore? I mean, we need a neutral party, like maybe a judge, who is not from PAP or not from opposition party to decide whether any film can be filmed in Singapore. Because I think that it's not right that for the PAP to decide that, that film is not suitable because it's against PAP. I think it's not fair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lim, for contributing today. I think perhaps that's something we need to discuss, Kumar. Lots of people with different interpretations of history, some of them depicted in a film, such as To Singapore with Love. That was what Mr. Lim was alluding to, a film by Tan Pin Pin. Now, with all of these interpretations flying around, all of these different depictions, how can one make sense of history and trust that this is reliable information or not?
I think it's a very good question, and I think your caller makes fair points. It's important as Singapore matures as a nation to be able to sort of listen to various interpretations of history. I mean, historians will tell you that you can look at a particular set of documents. Two guys can look at a set of documents and come out with different interpretations. So this is normal. This is what happens in the study of history, which is why you have so many history books about the same subject. And
right.
My own area of emergency, there have been so many different interpretations. The best way to sort of deal with it is to have a forum for some open discussion. So in this particular case, which he mentions,
the film To Singapore with Love by Tan Pin Pin.
My own personal view is have a screening and then have a round table immediately after that, and let's have a discussion. I mean, invite the producers, invite academics on both sides, those who are for, those who are against, and let's have a moderated discussion and let's see how it goes. And I'm sure that there will be one way to sort of dispel certain doubts by people like your caller about how things have been done.
How do you think a wider discussion about such things can be encouraged among young people who might also look back and say, why do I really need to know about what happened in our past?
Well, I think one of the key areas here is to, at a wider level, there's a need, worldwide, not just Singapore, to understand the value of the humanities. Many countries, new nations have industrialized, and for economic growth, you need a focus on the hard sciences, engineering. That's very important. But as societies mature, they also need to be able to develop a critical thinking, digital literacy in the social media age, and therefore education in humanities. History is one very good subject which will enable younger people to hone their critical thinking skills. So interest in history, ways and means to promote interest in history is certainly one of the key things to do.
What are your suggestions for some ways and means to do it? I mean, you did say earlier that it was quite prosaic, right? History lessons were like that in the past. Yeah. Today, what are the various ways school teachers already use to promote
at least
it?
Talking to my son who does history in school,
right.
I think it's a lot different from when I was doing history. I think there's more training in how to evaluate various sources. I think that's excellent, and so this sort of thing should be continued.
Right.
But in general, things like relaunching like the Battle of Merger talks to remind people, hey, that there was this really major event in 1962. That's a way to sort of like raise consciousness of the population. In the psyche of yeah, especially since next year is our 50th anniversary. So I think next year should be a history year.
Right. An opportunity for us to relearn and relook, isn't it?
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that it's so important to be able to evaluate various sources of such material. Give us an idea of what is already being done in this regard, because even Mr. Lim alluded earlier to, okay, he's not so sure if certain types of media are the right types of sources that one should look to. Obviously, most academics would say you need to really look at various sources, but the evaluation process, so on and so forth, how is that currently done?
Well, I mean, the long and short of it is you should not formulate your opinion or assessment of a particular historical event by just reading one particular book. I mean, one should make a practice of reading more than one book. In fact, you should have a range of sources which, contradict one another as well. I mean,
correct.
so that you can make an informed assessment on your own. I mean, that's the only thing you can do. I mean, if everybody says the same thing, then that's not really education.
But there was some concern about contradictions to some of the facts of the time, and of some revisionist historians having different points of view, particularly about the battle for merger. Can you give us an idea of what they were actually trying to say?
Well, I think in this particular case, right, the battle for merger and the coal store issue, I think one of the main issues there was the fact that some of the, for lack of a better term, revisionist historians were suggesting that the communist threat was overblown.
Right.
And in fact, some of them even
not as serious as it seemed to have been.
Well, some of them even say that the historiography does not give evidence of communism. So that's very strong and really flies in the face of evidence of most people, most scholars. I mean, even the communists themselves admitted. They came out and wrote about it. They said that,
one of them.
Well, Fang Chong Pi, the plan. I mean, they all came out and said that they were active. So I mean, that's why we should really be very careful of in what we read as well. So we should have this. If we don't have this knowledge, sometimes we won't be able to tell. So that's why better historical knowledge is certainly something which should be promoted.
Now, Lim Chin Siong was the co-founder of the PAP with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Can you give us a little bit of background about Chin Siong? Why he leaned towards the left?
Well, Mr. Lim Chin Siong was a really well-known political figure from the 1950s. I mean, there's a famous vignette that, Mr. Lee introduced him to the then Chief Minister in the mid-50s, David Marshall, the Chief Minister, and saying that, Lim Chin Siong would be is a great orator and he'll be the next Prime Minister. And
that's right, he was known to be a really great orator, right?
Yeah.
Particularly in Hokkien.
That's right. And he was an excellent organizer. But he was also pretty much, there's a controversy about this, but, there's a lot of suggestions that he was the top Communist United Front operative. Yeah, so that is why there's been a lot of interest over the past decade, actually, over his actual status. I mean, was he a progressive leftist, as some of the revisionist historians are saying, or was he essentially, as the mainstream narrative says, was he actually a top communist United Front operative? So this is why there's this, partly why there's this, debate going on. But essentially, I think the records would show that, he was actually top communist operative, and we have had published accounts by, for example, top Malaysian Special Branch officers in 1990s that cited CPM elements actually coming back from where they were based in Beijing, and to sort of say that actually, he was one of us. Chin Seong was one of us.
Right. Okay.
It's a very interesting part of history that, which is why I say history is interesting.
Absolutely.
So at the end of it all, what key lessons would you say we can draw from such events that would be relevant to Singaporeans today and in the future?
I think as we approach the 50th anniversary of Singapore, it's important to pay attention to how we got here. We didn't just appear to be like this. I mean, there's a reason for it. So it's important to be, as an educated Singaporean citizen in the 21st century, we need to know our history.
All right. Thank you very much. Associate Professor Kumar Ramakrishnan. He is head of the Center of Excellence for National Security at the Nanyang Technological University. You can still talk to us on 938 Live's official Facebook page, official 938 Live, about the battle for merger. Thanks for joining us this morning.